I get a lot of comments telling me off for pushing my beliefs in my videos or doing political commentary on the things that I talk about. And you know what? Maybe they're right. Maybe political videos aren't what my audience is looking for. Maybe I should cool it a bit, make something non political. I'm bored. So instead of doing whatever that was, let's talk about what the TV series Mr. Robot has to say about the communist uprising. Mr. Robot is a series that aired first in 2015 for the USA Network. In broad terms, its plot is about mental illness as well as the desire for political, economic, and social change. The early show kind of lives in the shadow of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which, if you weren't tuned into politics at that time, was an early 2010s political project dedicated to ending the economic inequalities that capitalism is oh so good at creating.
Wall Street, it crashes, and people starve, people lose their jobs, things like that. We're very angry at Wall Street. It's the heart of capitalism, American capitalism especially. That's why we're here today at Wall Street.
Unfortunately, Occupy didn't really amount to much. This is partially due to crackdowns by governments and media, but I think a larger part of it was a lack of a clear goal. This is extremely common in protest movements, and you even see it today. Occupy was against the 1% and against big banks, but what was it actually concretely aiming for? Nobody could really agree. Mr. Robot asks the question, what if Occupy Wall Street had a plan? Mr. Robot centers around a mentally ill hacker man named Elliot, played by Rami Malek, who stumbles into a hacker collective called F Society. The name is cringe, but what do you expect when you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that... You know the thing. F Society's plan throughout Season 1 is to encrypt all of the debt records held within E Corp, which is the fictional megacorporation that owns all of the major debt-holding companies in the world. By encrypting these records, E Corp can't actually see who owes how much, and because debt isn't actually a physical thing that they can point at, if there's no record of the debt, then the debt doesn't exist, and everyone in the world is free of debt. There is no more debt economy. Credit cards, mortgages, student loans are all wiped away. This would also create the downfall conditions for E Corp, one of the biggest and most evil companies in the world. Throughout Season 1, we see this plan play out. It's kind of a superhero story in the way that a lot of hacker properties are. It's a quiet loner in public that turns into a superhuman revolutionary behind closed doors. Season 1 of Mr. Robot is triumphant, championing all the ideals of Occupy. The little guy bites back. Any of us can make a difference. The revolution will not be televised. It's a shining proclamation that the world doesn't have to be the way it is. But you know where this is going. Whether you've seen the show or not, you understand that revolution is never that simple. After Season 1, Mr. Robot's viewpoint on populism and radical politics becomes decidedly darker and more nuanced. Let's explore exactly why that is and what we can learn from the depictions of reform and revolution in this excellent, excellent show. For starters, let's understand a little bit more about Elliot, our protagonist, and the characters that surround him. I've mentioned that Elliot is mentally ill, but I haven't really gone into detail about the ways in which that mental illness manifests itself. Elliot, among other mental illnesses explained in the show, is a person with dissociative identity disorder. Primarily, he hallucinates a character played by Christian Slater named after the show, Mr. Robot. Mr. Robot is very big picture minded. He's rational, he's cold, and very often he comes off as uncaring for the people around him. Mr. Robot is the type of person who gets the job done. And in this case, the job is revolution. When the revolution isn't fully finished with the big encryption hack, Mr. Robot turns to much darker methods of accomplishing his goals. Specifically, Mr. Robot plans to destroy all paper records of the debt owed to E Corp by destroying a building in which all of those records are being stored. This plan went totally unbeknownst to Elliot, who protests the idea. Here we see the primary divergence between Elliot and Mr. Robot's conceptions of how we should go about accomplishing change. Elliot, while desperately wanting to see change in society, is ultimately a pacifist, and blowing up a building, to him, isn't fully worth the grand revolution that Mr. Robot is planning. Mr. Robot, on the other hand, is unconcerned about the death toll. He recognizes that the machines of capital kill more people every day, and he understands his violence as a means to an end of the greater violence perpetrated by E Corp and the wider capitalist society. To Mr. Robot, the ends justify the means, and there is no other way. Elliot insists that this cannot be the case, and that however important the revolution may be, doing a bad thing for a good reason is still doing a bad thing. Elliot begins to have a more reform-minded view of political change. Specifically in Season 3, he becomes obsessed with reversing what he's done and finding different ways to change the world. One method Elliot chooses is trying to work at E Corp and change things from the inside, rooting out corruption and finding more ethical ways to accomplish company goals. This is the method that your reform-minded people, like Social Democrats or Democratic Socialists, would applaud. Instead of destroying the system and taking it apart entirely, you work within the system to better the system. Some socialists even view this as a viable method of overthrowing the system. You take the democratic neoliberal capitalism that we live in, and you sort of ship of Theseus it, replacing individual parts with new, better ones, until eventually every part has been replaced and we've achieved socialism. Is this viable? Is this realistic? Well, the issue with this line of thinking is the idea that people in power during this process wouldn't A, notice, and B, take major steps to prevent this from happening. The fundamental assumption of this kind of reformist politics is the idea that there's nothing holding us back from achieving a better society, or if there is, those barriers are temporary and not inherent to the system that we currently live in. Here's what I mean. To a reformist in the United States, what's holding us back from achieving socialism? Well, there's a variety of things. There's the two-party system in the United States, where the closest thing to a left-wing party is the party of stasis, the party that encourages leaders like Joe Biden, who promised a group of wealthy donors on the campaign trail that if he were elected, nothing would fundamentally change. There's redlining and other methods of voter suppression that keep people wanting change quiet. But those are all just policies, right? And in a democratic system, policies can be changed. The identity of the Democratic Party has shifted before, why can't it do it again? Redlining is just another policy like segregation, and if people know about it and march and take action against it, it can change, and then there's nothing holding us back. To a reform-minded person, these barriers are not inherent to the system. They are temporary. They're policies, we can knock them down, and then we can move on. To put it in terms of computers, the machine is broken, but it's a software issue, not a hardware one. We don't have to take out all the parts or buy a new computer entirely to fix it, we just have to give it an update or two. The response to this from more revolution-minded leftists is pretty much boiled down to system rigged, but obviously there's a little more nuance to that position. Although none of them would admit it, this kind of thinking, the kind of thinking that would lead you to believe that reform could never happen in the United States, is almost rooted in a sort of respect for the people that run the system. Okay, before you burn me alive, let me explain what I mean by that. It's not that revolution-minded people respect the system in that they like its policies or they like the people that control those policies. When I say respect, I mean it in the way that prey respects its predators. When people say that reform can never work and that we need a revolution because you can't change the system within the system, what they're doing is acknowledging the competence of the people who control our society. Basically, just like what I said about revolution, reform could never be as simple as making changes from the inside, ship of Theseusing it, or whatever. The people in power would never let that happen. Hell, they don't even let it happen abroad. The CIA loves nothing more than overthrowing democratically elected socialists in other countries. Why do reform-minded people think they wouldn't just do the same thing here? Fundamentally, revolution-minded people understand that the people who run our government and the people who run the major corporations in our society are not stupid people. They're evil, obviously, and wrong, and sometimes they can do stupid things, but if there's one thing these people are good at, it's maintaining their position. Coupled with an understanding of these people's intelligence is an understanding of these people's priorities. What matters most to the CIA or the board at Exxon or any other major group that has a sphere of control in our society isn't democracy or humanity, it's profit. When it comes to Western capitalist democracy, the most important word isn't Western or democracy. The most important thing is capitalism. And to think that we can overthrow capitalism without the capitalists understanding what we're doing and stopping us is, to a revolutionary-minded socialist, a deeply naive plan that underestimates the power and ruthlessness of our enemies. Back to Mr. Robot and his grand revolution, though, because there is an aspect of this plot that I have yet to mention, which is the complicated relationship that Mr. Robot has with the Chinese hacker organization known as the Dark Army. The Dark Army is a hacker group that routinely does unethical things for whoever will pay for them. In Season 1, they're pretty much characterized just as mercenaries, doing jobs for the governments of countries like Russia and North Korea. Ooh, scary. But the depths of their depravity aren't really talked about much until after Season 2. First and foremost, remember that plan that Mr. Robot had to destroy all the records of debt in E-Corp by blowing up one building? Well, thanks to the Dark Army, that one building turns into 71 buildings in a coordinated attack with a death toll of over 3,000 people. When the plan to destroy one building was communicated, there was some nuance to it, which I tried to explain as best as I could, but 71 buildings is a lot more buildings. This is obviously an extremely awful thing, and I doubt even the most revolutionary communists could defend it. The Dark Army also kidnaps and murders two of the show's recurring characters in Season 1, Mobley and Trenton, and while their deaths aren't nearly as important in the grand scale of things as all of those people who died in those 71 buildings, in Season 1 you do really come to care for Mobley and Trenton, so seeing them is a clear flag that the Dark Army are bad people and you should not like them. The point I'm trying to stress here is that the Dark Army are not portrayed with very much nuance at all. Depending on your socio-political beliefs, F Society could be seen as great or going way too far. The Dark Army is not given this same treatment, and there are few reasons to why that could be. An uncharitable reading of Mr. Robot leads to two possible reasons for why the Dark Army is characterized this way. Mr. Robot, after Season 1, shifts from being in the shadow of Occupy to being in the shadow of the presidential campaign and eventual election of Donald J. Trump. There are lots of scenes in the show that reference or allude to him and provide commentary on his many scandals. To be more specific though, the Dark Army gains significantly more prominence in the show and becomes significantly more of a threat to our main characters during the 2016 election, when the liberal media was all in a fuss about Russian hackers and foreign interference in US politics. Once again, this is an uncharitable reading of the show, but evidence does point towards the Dark Army being a stand-in for Russian hacker groups and other foreign governments that pose a threat to the sanctity of the US's free democratic elections. This is a fair enough reading to make, but I think we can go further. I do believe that this was a motivation in the writing room for this group, but I don't think it was the only one. Much later in the show, we find out that the Dark Army, instead of being an independent faction or a wing of the Chinese government, is owned by the ominously named Deus Group. The Deus Group is a collective of very rich, very powerful people across the world who manipulate world politics to suit their agendas and interests. And more than that, far from being a collection of world leaders that conspire against the US, the Deus Group controls politics everywhere. So, it is my conclusion that, while also being a fear-based reaction to the presidency of Donald Trump, the Dark Army acts as commentary on the ways in which revolution is sponsored and co-opted by the powerful so that instead of toppling them, it suits their interests. In Season 3, Episode 7, Irving, a Dark Army operative, explains this phenomenon beautifully.
Get out up there. What is this? You know why those people are enjoying themselves so much, even though thousands died today in the biggest attack in U.S. history? That wasn't my fault. That wasn't supposed to happen. I want to know who made that call. Was it Tyrell? What about this other attack? That was never a part of my plan. See, kid, that's been your mistake the entire time. Thinking this whole thing's about your silly little plan. Your revolution is only allowed to happen because it was bought and paid for by people like them. Face it, no matter how hard you try, it's always the end result.
You try and reform, the rich notice, and they stop you. You try and do revolution, the rich notice, and they stop you. So then, what is Mr. Robot trying to say about political change? Is it going full doomer, our efforts are unimportant and worthless, we should give up? To be completely honest, I don't actually fully know. Like a lot of left-wing media, Mr. Robot is a lot more interested in pointing out problems than providing solutions. To cap this video off, I'm going to be talking about the 2 episodes in the series that inspire the most hope in me personally. These episodes, I think, communicate the message that Mr. Robot isn't a show whose central message is nihilistic. I'm sure there are other examples, but these are the ones that stuck out most to me, and the ones that I feel like I need to talk about. The first example is the episode directly after the one that I just mentioned. The one where Irving tells Mr. Robot that his grand revolution was pointless because the rich co-opted it. That episode was a gut punch. At this point, Elliot is considering suicide. But in this episode, he meets a young boy who ends up inadvertently saving his life. The boy, who turns out to be Trenton's brother, is locked out of his house and he ends up following Elliot around for the day. This kid is relentlessly innocent and kind, and as we learn more about him alongside Elliot, we remember why we as political actors do what we do. It's really easy on the left to get swept up in grand visions of the future, in the idea and the picture in your mind of a workers' uprising, of people overthrowing their masters, breaking the shackles, whatever. And when you do that, it sort of stops becoming real in your head. It is what it is to you. It's a fiction. It's an idea. So we sort of forget the actual material reasons and people that we're doing all this for. This episode reminds Elliot that the revolution isn't about him, or Mr. Robot, or the Dark Army, or E-Corp. It's about this kid, a working class child of immigrants who deserves better. The fact that despite all of the circumstances in his life, this child has yet to give up his optimism about the world means that there's still some humanity left, that it's not all pointless. Because if he can have hope, so can we, even if it's more hope for his future than for ours. The last example I want to give is the relationship between Darlene and Dom. Haven't really touched on these characters quite yet, so just to brief you, Darlene is Elliot's sister and co-revolutionary at F Society, and Dom is an FBI agent. Their relationship, kind of similar to the relationship between Elliot and Mr. Robot, is seen as sort of a unity between 2 different theories of how we should go about making positive change in the world. Darlene, just like Elliot and Mr. Robot, believes that a revolution led by people on the ground is the only good way to create a better world. Dom, as I mentioned, is an agent at the FBI, so obviously there is a contrast there. This conflict is resolved through an understanding that both of these methods of change can produce good in the world, and that maybe there is a little bit of room for both. In one of the only truly happy scenes in the entire show, Dom and Darlene sit on a park bench and watch as F Society's efforts create actual good for the people of the world. Darlene distributes the funds of the Deus group to everyone equally. As Darlene says, this is the biggest wealth transfer in the history of the world. Even after all the struggles that they went through and all the setbacks, F Society did do good for people. If the show was trying to say that revolution is naive and wrong, I refuse to believe that they would have put this scene in the show. Nearing the end of the episode, Dom refuses to run away with Darlene, and Dom gives Darlene the number of a contact she has at US cybersecurity in case Darlene ever decided to change her ways. This isn't portrayed as a dick move or as a betrayal, but simply an acknowledgement that these are two very different people, and that's okay. As I mentioned, if you go after political change in only one direction, if you throw all your eggs in one basket, our opponents will do the same and beat you. They have more eggs. We don't have to all agree so long as we're all doing our part and taking our path to making a better world. That might be enough to accomplish something. Through an understanding of the two relationships that dominate the show most, I think we can get a pretty clear picture of what Mr. Robot has to say about political change. Elliot and Mr. Robot disagree on the method by which we should be accomplishing a revolution, and Dom and Darlene disagree on whether or not we should be having a revolution at all. But all of these characters, in their own way, contribute to the wealth transfer in Season 4. Closer to the beginning of this video, I mentioned that after Season 1, Mr. Robot's portrayal of political radicalism and left-wing activism became a lot more nuanced over time, but that nuance isn't a rejection. Mr. Robot acknowledges that the revolution can and will positively impact a lot of people. Despite its understanding of the drawbacks of revolution, it is a deeply hopeful show. Its hopefulness doesn't come from the idea that a revolution will fix all of our problems or that the system can be reformed. Its hope is hope in people. People can, in various different ways and through various different methods, change others, change themselves, and ultimately change the world. A better world is possible. And I think that's a lesson that a lot of left-wing people need to be reminded of.